new wineskin so that the new wineskin will expand as it possibly ferments, and the bubbles come up and it expands. And so he says you can't put new wine into an old bottle. And so why is Jesus bringing this up here? Well, he's telling them, here's my belief. I believe Jesus is telling them, fasting is not going to do anybody any good until I take care of what's wrong with you. Right? So if you're doing fasting to make yourself more spiritual, until I take care of the sin problem, then and make you a new creature, then it's not going to do you any good to do any of these spiritual exercises. So if you're thinking that you're making yourself more spiritual by doing these things, you're still the same corrupt person you've always been. The only way that we can receive it, and the way we've always said it too, is we talk about, people use it as an example of you have to be made new before the Holy Spirit can be put into you. Well, that's the same thing Jesus is saying here, even about fasting. He's saying, look, if you fast without me changing you, your fasting's not going to make you have any more control over sin than what you had before. People under the Old Testament could fast all they want. It wasn't going to make them have control over sin. Until Jesus took care of it, then fasting didn't do any good. But now that we've been made new, we can use fasting as a means of showing God our mourning because we're waiting for Him, but also as a means of saying, God, you mean more to me than my necessary food. It's an expression of saying, God, I'm going to fast because I want to focus on spiritual things and drawing closer to you. But you can never really draw closer to God, that close to God, until that sin nature is taken away. And then when God does that, then God can do all kinds of things with you. But until that happens, he says, you're wanting them to fast, but the real benefit of fasting is not going to happen until you're born again, until you're sanctified. Then I can fill you with my Spirit. Then you can fast, and fasting will cause you to think about the things of the Spirit and think about the Holy Spirit having more and more control in your life. And then it will do you good. And so Jesus tells them two things. One, the reason they don't fast is because it's not time to fast. I'm here. You know, when we get to heaven, we're not going to fast forever because we're with Him. We're no need to mourn forever, because we're with Him forever. And so he says, there's no time to mourn. The second thing is that if you're doing this because you as Pharisees think that it's going to improve you spiritually, nothing will improve you spiritually till I take care of what's wrong with you spiritually. Then fasting will do you some good. So then it says in verse 23, and it came to pass that he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, and his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of corn. Now it says corn here in the King James Version. The corn that we're used to today, the corn on the cob and stuff like that, didn't exist. We didn't know anything about that until we came to the Americas, and the Indians showed us the kind of corn we eat today. Corn to them was wheat or grain. They would grow barley and wheat in the fields, and so they were walking through these wheat fields, and they were taking off the heads of the wheat, and they were mashing it up and making it into a little dough, and they were eating it. Well, it was a Sabbath day, and you're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath day, right? So they're eating this, they're plucking this, and they're mad at them, not because they're plucking this wheat or grain from the field. They're mad at them because they're doing it on the Sabbath day, and you're not supposed to, according to the law of God, do any kind of work on the Sabbath day. So the thing that we need to understand also about that is that it wasn't forbidden for you to do that. You say, well, they were stealing from that poor farmer out there. Well, no, they weren't. According to the law of Moses, if you needed something and you were passing through a field, you could do that and eat. Now, you couldn't harvest their field and say, I've decided I'm going to take this for myself. But if you needed something to eat as you were going through, you were allowed to take it and eat some, so you could sustain yourself as you were passing through. So that was perfectly legal according to the law of Moses. In fact, the Jews were told to not harvest the fields completely, so that if the poor came along, they would find some in the field so that you could eat. That's where we get our term years ago. We used to call our children's ministry gleaners. Gleaning was taking the last bits that were left behind by the harvester. If the harvesters missed something, the gleaners took what was left. They came after and took. Well, you were supposed to leave some of it in case that the poor came through. So that wasn't what they had a problem with. What they had a problem with was that they were plucking this food on the Sabbath day and eating it. And they said, that's not lawful for them to do that. Why aren't you stopping them? And Jesus said to them, have ye never read what David did when he had need and was an hungered, he and they that were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and did eat the showbread, which is not lawful to eat but for the priest, and gave also to them that were with him. This comes from 1 Samuel 21 is what he's talking about. David had his men, his 300 that were following him, or 400 that were following him. They were running from Saul and they had no food. And they came to a little town called Nob where the tabernacle had now been moved. The tent of God, and it was the home of the priests. And they came and David said, do you have any food here for my people to eat, my men to eat? And the priest, who was Abiathar, actually Abiathar's father, said, we don't have anything here for your men to eat. The only thing we have is the showbread. Now, under the law of Moses, they would put 12 loaves of showbread on the table of showbread in the tabernacle. And they would rotate it every so many days. And when they brought it out and put the new bread in, then the priest could eat the showbread. It was for them to eat after it had been on display on the table of showbread. But it was only lawful for the priest to eat it. But the priest said, the only thing I've got here is this bread that we took off the table of showbread. And David said, let us eat that. His men were starving. And so the priest gave him the bread, and David ate, even though it was unlawful. And he said, God never did anything to David. He said, why did God not punish David for that? And the reason was the spirit of the Sabbath. What was the Sabbath created for? It was created to benefit and help man. If these men are starving to death, then it's okay for you to let them eat on the Sabbath day. It was okay for David's men to eat of the showbread because God is more concerned about man than following the letter of the law. He's more concerned about following the spirit of the law, which everything's always been for the benefit of man. So Jesus is saying, just like David, there was no problem with David eating that showbread, which would only been eaten by the priest. There should be no problem with my people eating it because God is more concerned with the benefit and help man. God created the Sabbath to help men, not to overwork. So that men would take time and rest their bodies. And he said, so the basis of it all, the spirit of the Sabbath is to help those that are in need. So he says, why do your disciples eat? Now let me say this also. That priest gave David that bread thinking that he was still working for Saul. He didn't know that David was now running from Saul. When King Saul found out that he had given that bread to him, all of his family were murdered by Saul for giving him that bread because he had given aid to his enemy as far as Saul was concerned. So they all lost their lives for giving that bread. And then Abiathar was the only son that survived, and he became the high priest under David's administration. But just something that's sad to me in all of this story. He was doing something good, and Saul murdered him for doing something good. Anyway, so he said, the reason my disciples can eat this on the Sabbath day is because the spirit of the Sabbath is to help people. He says in verse 27, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. He said, you've got it backwards. You think I created this day so that man could do for the Sabbath, for that day. He said, I created man and created the Sabbath for the benefit of man. You've got it backwards. And he said, because you don't understand that all I've ever done is done for the benefit of man, you've misinterpreted my laws. You've thought that these things were the things that mattered to me. Man is what has always mattered to me. And I've done everything I've done. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. There's two meanings, and we'll close with this. There are two meanings on this. The Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath. He could be talking about men in general, saying men are over the Sabbath because the Sabbath was created for men. Now, that doesn't mean we defy the commandments of God, but we understand why the Sabbath is created. And if we're doing good, and he'll talk about this in the next chapter, if we're doing good on the Sabbath, we're not violating the Sabbath because the Sabbath was for good.
When God made the Sabbath, He'd rest, so He wanted these people to rest.
Right, right. And so he says, therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. So then he says that it also could be talking about Jesus and the fact that, why am I telling them they can eat on the Sabbath? Because I am Lord also of the Sabbath. You know, if I can forgive sins, I can also say the Sabbath also. I can say, I can interpret the Sabbath as it was meant to be interpreted. Remember, he's the one who wrote the law and gave the law. So he said, I think I know what I meant by the law when I gave it. You don't understand it, but I understand it because I gave the law. He was Emmanuel, God with us. And so, again, all of these things are coming about for people to see that it's all coming to a head because they're having a conflict with Jesus over how they interpret the laws of God. They didn't understand the laws of God. And Jesus was trying to set things right and how God looked at man and that God has always done to help man. But this is going to be the beginning of the conflict that Jesus has with the religious leaders. Okay, we'll stop right there and we'll pick up next week.